David, I say this with no offense. Men. Ugh. So stubborn. So stubborn. Hello, team, and welcome to Bureaucracy. I'm your host, Emily Gross. I'm very excited because I have David Gantz with me, and we're going to be talking all about what's going on with the economy and the tariffs and international trade. Oh my. David, how are you?
I'm good. Nice to be here.
Thank you so much for being here. We have a lot to unpack. And the thing that I love to always ask my guests is, why should we trust what you have to say?
Well, I've been doing this for a long time. Let's put it this way. There are a lot of other experts that you could read about, and most of them, I suspect, are saying pretty much the same thing. So either we're all wrong or most of us are right.
Perfect. And you have a very interesting, one of the reasons why I'm very happy to have you is because you have a lot of experience in economics and in law and all about international trade, especially all of the free trade agreements that the U.S. has been a part of. So very happy to have you. Before we begin, I am getting over a cold. And I have probably 4 times the amount of Tylenol in my body that I'm supposed to have. So I have my symbolic beer, but I will not be drinking. But I have my Talea watermelon sour ale. So cheers to you. And what about you, David?
Well, I'm drinking water because it's hot. I have my Klosteller beer, which is probably what you should be using because it's non-alcoholic and it wouldn't conflict with your Tylenol. But it's very
smart.
Good stuff, and it's shipped entirely from Germany. They don't make it at all in the U.S. And so it's one of those many products that is going to be hit with the new tariffs.
Yeah, so you better get all your orders in now.
Exactly.
All right. So it's been a whirlwind of the past couple of days, right? Started with American Liberation Day, putting that in quotes, whatever the fuck that means, right? With all these tariffs put on all of our trading partners in an unforeseeable amount, right? The stock market crashed. And now Trump has said he's put a 90-day pause on these tariffs for the most part. I think except 10% still stays. And the stock market was up, but now it's back down. But we still have like 145% tariff against China. Dave, what is going on?
Needless to say, I'm not sure. Certainly, I don't think Mr. Trump knows what's going on, and most of the rest of us haven't figured it out either. The ups and downs maybe even are more serious than the tariffs because the total uncertainty is just hobbling business investment, hiring, and deciding what they're going to do next. So that's a big part of the problem. And now we know the uncertainty, the chaos, is going to last at least until July 8th. And I would guess it's going to last a lot longer because things keep changing. It's worth keeping in mind that all that happened yesterday when Mr. Trump got scared because the market was tanking and some of his closest friends and advisor were telling him, do not do this. Instead of having really high tariffs on places like Vietnam, goods from Vietnam or Korea or Japan or Taiwan, 25, 30, 40% range, everything in most cases is a flat 10%, which is a lot more than it used to be. But there are big exceptions. First of all, you mentioned it's 145% unless it's changed in the last hour. On China. I'm guessing at some point that will get negotiated, but who knows how long. It's still 25% on all U.S. imports of automobiles, steel, and aluminum, which is a very big part of the U.S. Economy. You can't build anything without steel and aluminum. Goods from Mexico and Canada that are qualified for free trade under the USMCA, the trade agreement with Mexico, Canada, the U.S., come in duty-free, but roughly half of the goods that are coming from Canada and from Mexico are still being tariffed. They're being taxed now at 25%. So the idea that a lot of these tariffs have gone away, I think is very misleading. The average U.S. tariff these days, if you include China, is about 22, 24%. 3 months ago, it was 2.5%. So this is a huge change. And it's going to be very harmful, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things I do really want to talk about is because we had Mark Zandi, the chief economist at Moody's Analytics, on a couple months ago to talk all about tariffs. And so kind of got a good idea of the fact that, like you said, 98% of economists will say tariffs are a bad thing, right? Sometimes, you have to do it, right? But it's going to impact the consumer the most. What I find really interesting is what Trump's been talking about, which is trade deficits. Could you elaborate a little bit more on these trade deficits and why Trump thinks it's important and to right the wrongs, I guess, in his words?
It's really hard for me and for economists that know a lot more than I do to figure out why he is so obsessed with trade deficits. I think it's reasonable to be upset about the fact that we get a lot more goods from China than we can sell to China. There's reasons for that. And I think dealing with the deficit with China, whatever ways you can figure it out, Mr. Biden tried some, Trump tried other, is pretty reasonable. But to get upset because we have a trade deficit with Lesotho in Africa, because we import blue jeans and diamonds from there, and they don't buy very much stuff from us, I think is, to use a technical term, idiotic. The problem, I think, with trade deficits is they tend to be structural. Part of the problem is Americans don't save enough. So we have to go out elsewhere and borrow money. Part of the problem is we run these humongous growing budget deficits, which cause additional problems. But I think even if we were being responsible financially, we would still have deficits because the U.S. economy, at least until now, has been, notwithstanding all the complaints by the current administration, has been one of the strongest, most robust in the world. We've had the highest growth rate of any developed country for quite some time. And we buy a lot of stuff. We buy stuff from Amazon. We go to Target. We buy cars. We buy refrigerators. We buy beer. Because we have, or at least many of us, not the lowest 20 or 25%, but most of us have some disposable income so we could do what we want. And many of us have felt that we were doing pretty well because the stock market was reaching new highs. That's gone. But the only serious way to significantly reduce the trade deficit is for us to go into a very serious recession. If we do that, we stop spending money at Amazon or Target or anywhere else, and the deficit will go down because we won't be importing as much stuff from China or Vietnam or the UK or Lesotho.
Wow. Okay. So you're saying that the only way to really reduce the trade deficit in a substantial way is if we are in a recession?
Either that or have major changes in the way government finances are operated. And it's not just Mr. Trump or Mr. Biden. I mean, we've been running deficits since, I guess, the second Clinton administration. If we raise more tax money, we wouldn't have to borrow so much money from China and everywhere else. And if each of us decided to save more rather than spend more, that would provide more financing for all the things that we need to do inside the U.S. If you believe that that is going to happen in the foreseeable future, I think you're being a bit naive, particularly when Congress is spending an enormous amount of money right now trying to figure out how to bring about new tax cuts, mostly for the wealthy, but still big tax cuts. And so there really is, and there's no humanly possible way that all of these new tariffs will do much to reduce the deficit, because the higher the tariffs go, the fewer things people buy. And in any event, it just doesn't produce enough revenue. Back before the income tax of 1913, our major source of revenue in the U.S. was customs duties. But we weren't spending nearly as much then, and that's a very long time ago. So it won't work anymore.
Right. I believe it accounts for 1% of our GDP, something around
something in that. Somewhere between 1 and 2, but not very much.
Not very much.
I mean,
so why is it so much cheaper to produce things in these other countries?
Well, there are a lot of reasons. The most significant one is labor costs. Let's assume you're making a Ford F-150 in Mexico. You're paying your workers about $5 or $6 an hour. If you're making it in the Detroit area, you're paying them about $35 an hour. Now, you can reduce some of that difference by having a lot of robots, a lot of machinery, and the auto industry has been reducing the number of people it took to build a car on a regular basis for the last 30 or 40 years. But there's still a long way to go. And I don't think there's any way to equalize the manufacturing costs without, as long as there is a big difference in hourly labor costs. And I mean, in time, maybe Mexico will get closer, but I think that's decades off.
Okay. And so then basically, but it's like things are cheaper elsewhere. So is it just cost of living is less?
No, it's more than that. For example, in the steel industry, U.S. Steel, which was negotiating a while ago with Nippon Steel, a Japanese steel company, to come in and provide a lot of funding for new and more modern equipment. I mean, their facilities near Pittsburgh are using the same equipment they were using 100 years ago. And there's a lot of new technology, mostly electric arc furnaces, which means they could be making steel much more efficiently, using less energy and less fewer people, more automation. So that's one example. I think there are other things though that you just can't you can't make Nike shoes without a lot of labor. You can't make a lot of the clothing that we wear without a lot of the labor. And the cost of making this shirt in the U.S. rather than, I think it's Vietnam, it probably would go up by 4 or 5 times. And most Americans aren't that enthusiastic about bringing jobs home. And whether you can find a lot of people that want to work for $15 an hour sewing shirts is another big question when you have a very, very tight labor market, very low unemployment. So I think a lot of this is just impossible. Now, there are things I think you could do it with. I think we could make a chips industry here with a lot of money and a lot of automation. I think that it's entirely possible that we could, in time, be competitive worldwide with, say, with Taiwan, who's a leader. And if you figure in the fact that, well, maybe it's more expensive, but there's really a national security issue, I think that particular Biden administration policy subsidies made a huge amount of success. Whether subsidizing the electric vehicle and battery market makes as much sense, I think people can reasonably differ.
Interesting. It's very interesting. Because, I mean, it's all about manufacturing. It's all about trade deficits. But, and like, sure, we should absolutely, I'm all for bringing back more jobs and stuff like that, but it's not just going to come through like this. There has to be a multi-pronged approach in order to make it successul. It's from what I'm hearing.
It's in some sectors, it's possible. I don't think in the foreseeable future, you're not going to be making iPhones here. You're not going to be making clothing. You're not going to be making Nike shoes. You're probably not going to be making flat screen TVs either. You could be making more cars if you want to spend a lot more money for the car. If you want to spend anywhere from $3,000 to $12,000 per car, with the average being around $48,000, you could move a lot of production that is currently in Mexico back to the United States. But it would take at least several years to do that. And it means the cars would be a lot more expensive, which means more and more people would be able to not be able to afford them. So these are the trade-offs. I mean, if you really want everything made in the U.S., it's theoretically possible, but most people won't be able to afford what you're making.
Right. And so one of the big things that he's been saying is that he wanted to bring everyone back to the negotiation table. How? And he says the tariffs against us were very high, and that's why he wants to bring back to the negotiation table. Was there this big difference between our trading partners?
I think there's a big difference between what he's using today, which is a shotgun approach, hit everybody, 70, 80, 90 countries, rather than focusing on a few sectors or a few countries. There are definitely some countries out there where, in this day and age, the tariffs are too high. Certainly Vietnam, certainly Brazil, certainly India, and probably at least half a dozen others. There are also some situations where individual product tariffs are unreasonably high. We shouldn't have to pay in the U.S. 10% to send a car into the European Union, although if they're sending a truck into the U.S., it's 25%. But there are all sorts of spikes. So I think an argument can be made that there should be a focus on areas where it seems at this day and age, there's no reason why India or Brazil or Vietnam are charging high tariffs on certain products or on some of our agricultural goods. So I'm not one of those who says tariffs are never something you should negotiate. One reason we have 15 free trade agreements is we were able to negotiate the other country to lower its tariffs on agricultural products or goods that were interested. And in all of those agreements, we paid a lot of attention to our service exports. So, I mean, we are probably the most efficient country in the world in terms of services, whether it's legal services or education or cloud computing or any of those things. We have about a $300 billion a year trade surplus in services, although this administration doesn't pay any attention to it. So a lot of the negotiations we've been in on free trade agreements and at the WTO 25 years ago, we're trying to get better access for the very dynamic and rapidly growing U.S. services market. And we were successful in a significant way in most of our trade agreements, including the USMCA. But now, of course, the free trade agreements are pretty much up in the air because we're violating all of them.
Yeah, my roommate and I were talking about, she's like, isn't this like against about something else? She's like, isn't this against the Constitution? I'm like, the Constitution's out the window, babe. I was like, it's been gone since he got in office. And I was like, Constitution, Constitution. Like, it's not even being acknowledged. That being said, I mean, just an obscene violation of any type of rule and norm and general decency. Is there any chance this works?
What do you mean by work?
This is a big bet that the Trump admin is taking in order to bring back manufacturing and lower tariffs, right? And it says lowering, like we said, manufacturing is a whole other can of worms, but lowering tariffs and encouraging countries to buy more from America, right? It's a huge bet. Is there any chance is it going to work?
I think it's a tough sell to be imposing very high tariffs on other countries and saying, well, you should buy more stuff from us. I think if you're having a negotiation, let's say with Vietnam, and you say, okay, we will get rid of that, whatever, 10% or 45% tariff, but you have to let in our natural gas, you have to let in our agricultural products. And in other words, buy more stuff, make it easier for your companies to buy more stuff from us. I think you might get some benefit from that. Again, I don't think there's a lot of countries out there where it makes a lot of difference, but certainly Brazil and India and Vietnam and maybe a few others you might well benefit. But that doesn't explain why you're hitting the UK, for example, and Australia, both of whom have a trade deficit with us. We have a trade surplus with them. What's the rationale for hitting them with a 10% tariff? I haven't been able to find it. Maybe somebody else has, and maybe it makes Mr. Trump feel good or makes some of his advisors feel good. But I don't think there's any economic reason why that should happen. But again, there are sectors where if we want to have a more expensive product, like automobiles and chips, we could probably make more of them in the United States if you could get people to buy them at the higher price. You start putting tariffs on pharmaceutical products, which is being talked about very seriously. It's obviously going to drive up the cost of healthcare. If you're making that product in the U.S., if you're making whatever you're taking, Excedrin or aspirin or something else.
Those are some of my favorite drugs.
Okay. Yeah. None of it was made in the U.S. It was probably made in India, maybe in China, maybe somewhere, maybe some of it in Mexico.
They do a great job.
And if you want to pay 3 or 4 times for the same bottle,
I don't want to do that.
Is that a trade-off? I think most people would say that's not a very good trade-off, that we're better off buying those drugs and over-the-counter and the ingredients that go into prescription drugs from places like India, which make them very effectively. And I think the major drug companies in the EU, where we import, we're better off if we don't have to pay extra tariffs on those because they're, as we all know, medicines are already through the roof anyhow, so we don't really want to have to pay more. And I don't know what sense of satisfaction it would give you or me to say, well, this is twice what I used to pay for it last year, but it's made in the U.S. That's ridiculous, if you ask me.
Yeah. I mean, the only argument I can think of is kind of like what I'm reading between the lines about why things are much more expensive when they're American made versus, well, one I've heard a lot about, like China subsidizes a lot of manufacturing. I mean, the U.S. has a lot of labor laws and regulations, which I personally believe in are fundamentally important, right? Like, do I think some of the states that are offering 14-year-olds the ability to work in meatpacking facilities, do I think that's good? No. Is it because a lot of countries, right? One, because of government subsidies, but two, because of lackadaisical labor laws that things are cheaper?
I think it's a combination of things. Certainly with China, mammoth subsidies, particularly in the auto industry, the steel industry, the solar panel industry, are obviously distorting the world market in a very significant way. Secondly, labor laws and labor costs are very different. China does not have much of a safety net. When your parents get old, you and I are supposed to support them because they're not going to get anything significant in Social Security from the government. And you take the automotive sector, which has been heavily subsidized by China for at least 20 years. But I think most people would admit that some of the better products, BYD, are at least as good and maybe better than a lot of the cars that are made in the United States. But that's in part, significant part because they've been subsidized through the roof for at least 2 decades. So when you're competing with China, you're competing with the subsidies, you're competing with a huge amount of government financing and support for research and development, which we don't have in the U.S. anymore. If you look at Mexico, it's a very different picture. There aren't many in the subsidies, but labor costs, again, are about 20% of what they are in the U.S., and it's only very, very recently, with the beginning of the USMCA, that you had any serious effort to preserve labor rights of the workers in Mexico. And obviously, that's one of the reasons, a major reason, why it's cheaper to make stuff in Mexico. But it's not because of government subsidies, because the Mexican government can't afford it.
Interesting. Could the American government afford subsidies like China does?
Industrial policy used to be a dirty word. It's not anymore, partly because the Biden administration, with supports mostly from the Democrats in Congress, decided that it was in the national interest to reestablish a chips industry. And they also decided it was in the national interest to have electric vehicles and electric vehicle batteries made mostly in the U.S. And I think part of that was because they had interest in protecting the environment, and part of that is because they were trying to get more support from the auto unions. And I don't know which came out on top. I don't know offhand of any other sectors that would deserve that kind of help. Maybe some, face masks, so we don't have to depend on China or Korea the next time we have an epidemic. But again, it's a question of how much money you want to spend. And it's also a question of somebody, the president, the Congress, everybody else, combination, deciding which industries are favorable. Both the Biden and the Trump industries have provided enormous amounts of, not subsidies, benefits to the steel industry. If you raise tariffs on imported steel, the domestic companies can also raise tariffs. It's not technically a subsidy, but in economic terms, we're all subsidizing the steel industry with our tax money or with the money we pay indirectly for tariffs. I mean, after all, tariffs are taxes, federal taxes, just like the income tax we're all going to pay on Tuesday. And they're paid by the importer, and they're typically passed on all the way up the supply chain, either to the manufacturer, but ultimately to you and me, to consumers, whether we're buying, as I say, we're buying TV sets or cars and a lot of our groceries, shoes, clothing. So basically, when you have tariffs, you're trying to protect domestic industries when there are some, but there aren't any to speak of who are making clothes or shoes, and there's certainly none that are making television sets. There are some that are making cars. The unions like the idea of moving all the production to the U.S., but of course, if the cars become so expensive that people can't buy them, they're going to get laid off. So there's a lot of trade-offs, and there are a lot of gambles. One of the things with tariffs is you don't always know what the impact is going to be.
Right. So what do you think the outcome is going to be between this trade war between China and the U.S., because neither one's backing down at the moment?
My hope would be, and I don't know that I think it's going to happen, my hope would be is that you could find some intermediary, like Singapore, for example, which has good relations both with the U.S. and China, who could step in and say privately, look, this can't go on because it's wrecking the entire world economy. You both need to reduce your tariffs in parallel to some number, 50%, who knows what it's going to be, to get it to a point where people can still do business. Because at 140%, nobody can afford to import anything from China, and pretty much vice versa on their side.
I think it's like 84% tariffs for U.S. products.
If you're a farmer that grows soybeans and corn and pigs and beef, there's no way you can sell them to China with that kind of a tariff. Brazil will take over the soybean market, Argentina, Ukraine, probably the wheat market, but the U.S. is simply going to be out of luck because those costs are just prohibitively high. Maybe you could absorb 10 or 15%. Some grain sellers have done that in the U.S., but you're not going to absorb anything like the numbers we're talking about.
You think one of them is going to back down eventually?
I think both Chairman Xi and Mr. Trump have very substantial egos, and they have enormous. Their countries have enormous economic power. So it seems to me that we need somebody to go in there so they can save face together rather than one blinking first. Because I don't think Mr. Xi is going to blink, and I'm pretty sure Mr. Trump is not going to blink either, even if it wrecks the U.S. and the Chinese economy, which it may well do.
David, I say this with no offense. Men. Ugh. So stubborn. So stubborn. So there's been a lot of claims around insider trading, and there's been some talks that the tanking of the stock market was done on purpose, and the relieving of some of these tariffs for 90 days was also done, and there have been some insiders that knew about it and were able to make a crap ton of money from this stuff. Do you think that holds any weight?
The short answer is I have no way of knowing. I think it's probably not accurate to say that Mr. Trump intended for the market to go down by 10%, although he may have been told that was going to happen. There's been a lot of fluctuations going on in the last, 36, 48 hours. And I'm more suspicious of what's going on there because a lot of the people that had been advising Mr. Trump over the last few weeks, including the Secretary of Commerce, the Secretary of the Treasury, and a number of outside financial people who are very close to Mr. Trump, have a huge stake in making money in the stock market. I don't know. In a rational government, there would probably be an investigation. But the Democrats have no power in Congress, and I would say the chances that the Attorney General of the United States is going to investigate are somewhere between 0 and nothing at all.
Yeah.
So I doubt that anybody is going to get investigated for this. There are a number of, I had correspondence with one of them this morning. There are a number of European analysts who are saying, well, what do you do about insider trading if the president or the government is doing it? And the short answer is, in this administration, nothing's going to happen. Anything is possible. And I suppose if you had some really messy scandals come out, that might be different. If you catch the president's relatives or close friends who obviously benefited from short selling something, for example, then you might have something. But I think unless you have a really serious smoking gun, nothing's going to happen.
To be honest, I love the idea that someone might be held accountable. I literally don't think it could happen in any situation in this administration. I mean, they could be caught sending a text message on Signal, right? Being like, gonna do this. And it could include Jeffrey Goldberg in it, like gonna short this, and nothing's gonna happen. So who knows? I feel like we've covered a pretty wide gamut of things. Is there anything else you want to touch on?
Well, I think one of the things that we need to focus on, or at least people who are concerned about what's happening and what's going to be happening in the next 3 months, as I've mentioned before. And that is the most important thing for businesses is probably the biggest problem is uncertainty. If they know what the tariffs are going to be, even very high tariffs on China, they may be able to adjust if they have some time to do it. I mean, you can try to move. People have been moving their operations out of China into Mexico and Vietnam and Malaysia, places like that now for 5 or 6 years, under the pressure of the Trump administration and the Biden administration, and that process could very easily continue. But to tell the auto industry that you have to move to the U.S. and your tariffs are going to start in 30 days is ludicrous. Under the best of circumstances, it would probably take Ford or General Motors, even if they have the capacity, at least 6 months or 9 months to increase their production in the U.S. And when Honda said a few weeks ago that they were going to move the Civic production, I think from Mexico to Ohio, they said it's going to take 2 years. So if you were really serious, it seems to me, and logical about trying to get more auto production in the U.S., you would say, okay, you've all got 2 years or 2 years and 6 months, and we're not going to touch the tariffs. But 2 years from now, they're going to go up to 25%. And that would give most people a chance either to decide they wanted to move production to the U.S. or to decide that, for example, if you're General Motors or Ford or Stellantis, there are just certain models you're making in Mexico that you can't afford to make in the U.S., so you just stop bringing them into the United States. but it would give companies some options. They're not necessarily good options, but they would definitely have some alternatives. But the idea that somehow people are going to change, you expand an auto assembly plant, it's probably going to take you at least a year, maybe 2 years, and it's probably going to cost tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars to do it. And in addition to the fact that you just can't do it fast, nobody really wants to put that kind of money into new facilities and to essentially abandon facilities in Mexico unless you think there will be a period of 5 or 10 or 15 years when these facilities will be productive. So uncertainty is the biggest problem we're all dealing with, and it pretty much permeates, I think, the entire economy. And the big companies, Amazon's fine for the moment. They just cancel all sorts of orders with no notice, and nobody's going to do anything about it. Maybe Target and Walmart have the same clout. If you have some small tent seller in California, and there was something in one of the papers this morning, who buys some of their products from China and some of their products in the U.S., and they can't afford the Chinese products anymore, they'll just close their doors. They can't survive. I think if you're running a small boutique, women's boutique for dresses, and you are heavily involved in China and you can't afford that, and you're going to have high tariffs on the goods that you finally get from Vietnam, it's going to be almost 45%, you're going to close. You can't very well keep going. There's no way you can mark up clothing enough to cover the tariffs, and there's no way you can make enough money to keep employing your employees or paying your rent. So I suspect if this continues, there are going to be a lot of small and medium-sized businesses that just close their doors the way they did in COVID-19. And I think the big difference is many of them will never open them again. And I don't see how you avoid that if you have tariffs at this level. I mean, being rational, a 10% tariff probably doesn't destroy your business. If you have a Mini, so let's say coming in at $30,000, that's the from the UK, and the tariff is 10%, $3,000, but it sells for $50,000. So maybe you can't pass on the full $3,000, but you probably can pass on at least half of it. So you can probably stay in business, particularly if you think some of this is temporary. If it's a 20% tariff, which is the number that was going to be imposed on the EU, and you're like audited, you're just holding your cars in bond in Baltimore because you're not going to bring them into the U.S. You're not going to pay 20%. Now, maybe with 10%, they will. Who knows? So a lot of it depends on the amount of the tariff and what the markup is. One of the nice things about Nike and Adidas and those people is it's a very substantial markup, at least there used to be, from the customs price and what actually is paid for retail. So if you have 100% markup, you might be able to absorb some of the tariff. But if you're bringing in bicycles, which typically have a very small markup, under 20%, there's no way you're going to absorb any of the tariffs from China. So much of what we're discussing has to be on a product or sector-specific basis, because it makes a huge amount of difference depending on how business is done and what kind of margins you have.
Chaos. Absolute chaos.
Chaos is the operative word. Chaos and uncertainty.
Awesome. Perfect. You know what the markets love? Chaos and uncertainty. And everyone, don't look at your 401ks. It's not pleasant. Hopefully they'll right the way, though, and this will be figured out, and Trump will realize that he's a dum-dum, and this will be okay.
And what have you been smoking lately?
I know. Whatever it is, I need it to be stronger, David. It's not working. All right. David, this has been so insightful and helpful. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Well, it's an interesting subject, and obviously we both think it's important that people who are not experts in economics or the law have an idea of what's going on, because all of our costs are going to go, or many of our costs are going to go up. Our groceries, our cars, our television sets, our clothes, our shoes, not evenly, not consistently, but 2 weeks from now, we're going to be spending more at the grocery store. I think if you want to buy a car or a pair of Nikes, which I told my class this morning, Do it now while current supplies last, which is for all cars is 7 or 8 weeks. For shoes, I don't know, probably a month or two. Because if you wait 3 months, the costs are going to be a lot higher for the same product. And I think that's what we're looking at, a significant push for more inflation, and that may or may not convince the Fed to drop interest rates. Do I think this will push us into a recession? I don't know enough economics to say that. There's some, there are people out there say, well, it's 50% or 60%. And of course, it changed from yesterday to today. It will be more interesting to see what happens on July 8th on the assumption that whatever the administration does, that will continue for more than a few months. But who knows? So I think it's probably a good time not to be spending your money on things you don't really need or want.
David, thank you so much for doing this. This podcast was supposed to be like a fun thing, talk about the issues in a fun way. And there's the past episodes that have just been real bummers.
It's hard to do this. It's hard to do this without getting more depressed because
I know. That's why the beer's involved.
Well, but I still got the cap on it, so
I know,
it doesn't help me much.
I looked at it and it made me feel better. So,
well, that's good. I can see that would be a big part of your operation.
Exactly. Well, David, thank you so much. And I'm your host, Emily Gross. We'll be back next week with another episode of Bureaucracy.
My pleasure.